was here. About 3 times a year. Okay, the plenary will be starting shortly. We've had some minor hiccups, but I was asked by Jackie to talk to all of you about something right before the plenary. I hope you're all having an enjoyable YDS conference. She also asked me to tell you guys a little bit about my first conference. The first YDS conference I ever went to was when I met Jackie, and I owe a lot to YDS as an organization. There is no Eastern Seaboard city I could go to without just knowing I have someplace to stay because of YDS. And that's possibly one of the most wonderful and liberating things when you're getting out of school, is knowing you just have a network of people that, exist, that you can just count on. And what's important to know is that the only way a lot of us can get to this conference is through DSA and through some of the funding that DSA has provided us. It's not just travel scholarships, but it's also putting food out for us and also reserving a conference space and a place, to hang out afterwards. And what's surprising about DSA, and I guess probably not surprising, that it's a membership-funded only organization. So it's probably not surprising to you that we don't really get any corporate money. So what's important about this is because we're a membership-only organization, we're limited in size. We only have 2 full-time staff and 2 part-time staff. And I can attest, and I think Jackie can attest strongly, that they're overworked and underappreciated. So what I'm asking you to do about this today is the fact that we need to sort of pay this forward. So in your packets, you have a pink piece of paper. And on this is redistribute to build YDS. And what I'm asking you now is to think about and strongly urge you to hopefully contribute to DSA and YDS in the future. I know most of us are students, unemployed or even underemployed. This doesn't mean we don't have $10 or perhaps more than that to spare. So I want you to look at this form, and if you think you can contribute to an organization that has helped many people, myself included, fill it out with whatever you can possibly give, and I will be in the back to collect them. We take cash, we love cash, and credit cards as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Beth, and she'll probably start the plenary.
Hi. Oh, it's not on. Hi. Testing? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Cozzolino. I'm the co-chair, along with Matt. And so I'm going to be introducing the speakers. We only have 2 speakers tonight because Serge is unable to make it. But at the end of the session, we will be having a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please write them down as we go through so that you don't forget them when it comes time for Q&A. Okay. Mike Konczal is a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, where he works on financial reform, unemployment, inequality, and a progressive vision of the economy. His blog, Rarity Bomb, was named one of the 25 best financial blogs by Time Magazine. His writing has appeared in the Boston Review, the American Prospect, the Washington Monthly, The Nation, Slate, and Dissent, and he's appeared on PBS NewsHour, MSNBC's Rachel Maddow Show, CNN, Marketplace, and more. And Joanne Barkan is a writer based in New York City and Truro, Massachusetts, and a member of the editorial board of Dissent Magazine. Her most recent work is on the effort of the self-proclaimed reform movement to remake public education in the United States. Barkan is also the author of Vision of Emancipation, the Italian workers' movement since 1945, and many books of fiction, nonfiction, and verse for young readers. So let's welcome our speakers.
Okay, I want to see everyone. So I think I'm going to speak from up here. Can you hear me? No. Okay. Can you hear me like this? No. Can you hear me like this? Yes. Okay. So this is going to take more coordination than I had anticipated because I'm going to have to deal with my papers and this microphone. Anyway, thanks very much to YDS for inviting me. Thanks for all of you for being here. And I want to say very, very sincerely that it's great to be in a room full of democratic socialists, especially young democratic socialists. I was asked to mention this fact that I was in the national leadership of DSA for about a decade in the 1980s. So I, of course, feel very close to all of you. What I'm going to talk about today is what I think is a very, is this annoyingly echoey? It's okay? Okay. I'm going to talk to you today about public schools, kindergarten through high school, because I think that this is an absolutely essential topic for all democratic socialists. You can't have a truly strong democracy without a public education system that is excellent across the board and accessible to all children. And the reasons for this are clear. First, for society as a whole, a functioning democracy depends on a well-informed and engaged citizenry, and public schools are the main tool for creating this citizenry. Now, for individuals, a real democracy requires equality of opportunity, and a good system of public education is the most important means of creating a level playing field. When the best education belongs to only those with money and power, you don't have a democracy, you have a plutocracy. Now, in a truly democratic society, public school education would be a highly respected, high-prestige, well-paid profession. It would be open to the most talented, the best trained, and the most committed. This isn't true now in the United States, and historically, American public education, or American education in general, has been most undermined by segregation. Segregation by race, but also socioeconomic class. Today, when poor and minority children arrive for their first day of kindergarten, they are already behind. And that gap is established not during the course of the time they're going to school, it's established by age 2. And so what we have in the United States is really not so much the so-called achievement gap, we have a preparation gap. This is a huge problem in the United States because we have a high level of child poverty. Child poverty in the United States is about 22%. So this affects public schooling throughout. But while poverty is our greatest long-term and ongoing problem, the greatest immediate threat to public education today is this self-proclaimed K-12 education reform movement. Now, at this point, I would say this movement is best described as a privatization movement. And by that I mean that privatizing public education in the United States means giving approximately the $550 billion in tax money that is spent every year on K-12 education to private individuals and private businesses to run the schools. And there is a very close comparison that can be made to understand what this is structurally, and that's the prison system in the United States today, which is being privatized. It's really exactly the same phenomenon. Now, some people are familiar with some of these ed reforms, and others aren't. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through the list of them, and it's a long list, just so you can know what I'm talking about specifically. First, a hugely increased amount of standardized testing, especially in inner city schools. And this, of course, benefits most of all the ever-growing politically connected testing industry. Second, evaluations of teachers, principals, and schools based on student test scores, on standardized tests. And this is a highly unreliable and a very narrow measure, but it's used now to fire teachers and to shut down schools. Next, the closing of large numbers of public schools in inner city districts. For example, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who has control of the public schools in New York City, has closed down 140 public schools since 2002. Replacing public schools with charter schools, which are run by private management corporations. Some of these are for-profit schools, but almost all of them are non-union. Channeling resources into computer-based instruction and virtual schools, with absolutely no research showing that these are effective practices. Transferring control of school districts away from elected boards to mayors and governors and their appointed administrators. And this is happening all around the country, and you can see it happen. It's happened here in New York City. Hiring non-educators to run school districts as if they were private corporations. So-called alternative paths to teacher certification. The most famous of these is, of course, Teach for America. Typically, and Teach for America isn't the only alternative road to certification. Typically, after a training program of just 4 or 5 weeks, the rookies, who are usually non-union and lower paid, are sent into high-poverty schools to teach. And when they leave after 2 years or a year or 3 years, of course it creates tremendous disruption. It means that these schools, that are the schools that really should have the most stable and the most experienced and the best teaching forces, have the most unstable and impermanent. Okay, and finally, vouchers. Vouchers allow parents to take their per-child tax funding out of the public system to a private school, including religious schools. And the nationwide voucher system was first proposed in the 1950s by Uber market guru Milton Friedman. And for him, it was a way of eliminating real public schools, having all the schools privately run, although the funding would be tax dollars. Now, the reformers have generated a fair amount of support for these policies and also a sense of urgency by making 3 claims. The first is that K-12 education in the United States is failing so badly that it's now a national security risk. Condoleezza Rice is out there publicly with this position. And that the primary cause for failure in the public schools is the poor quality of the public school teachers. And of course, the main problem with the public school teachers is their union. All you have to do to fix the public schools is to fix the teachers. And the third point is that anyone who talks about poverty for an ed reformer is simply defending the status quo. So the next thing that I want to do is to give you some data to show how these claims of the ed reform movement are completely incorrect. First of all, what are the actual trends in public education in the United States? There's only one longitudinal or long-term measure, which is the National Assessment of Education Progress. These are the tests that are given nationally in 4th, 8th, and 12th grades. It's considered the gold standard of testing, or perhaps the only decent test there are. And the scores show, much to the surprise of most people, that American students have improved substantially, in some cases phenomenally, over the last 4 decades. And here's one example. In 4th grade math, Black students now have higher average achievement than white students had when the assessments began in the 1970s. Okay, a second batch of data to refute the ed reformers. How does public education in the United States actually compare to public education in other countries? Now, the comparisons are actually very complex and very difficult to make because you have national differences in who goes to school, what is taught, how it's taught, and also in how poverty is measured. But I'll give you one snapshot. The most recent available data comes from the international test called the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA. These are 2009 scores, which are the last scores for the United States that have been broken down by socioeconomic class, which is why they're significant. So this is the comparison. When you look at the achievement of students in the schools in the United States where the level of poverty, which as you know is measured by the amount of free lunches and partially subsidized lunches there are in the school for the students. When you look at the schools that have a poverty rate of less than 10%, and then you compare them to the 8 countries that were in this group of about 70 countries, the 8 countries that have a poverty rate also less than 10%, the US students scored substantially ahead of every other country. Now, as the level of poverty increases in the public schools, the scores go down. And so because the level of poverty in the United States among kids is so high that the United States came in 14th overall on these tests. So the ed reformers will say, look, we're 14th, our lunch is being eaten, this is going to be catastrophic, we're going to become slaves of the world. But in fact, once again, this really isn't a problem of all public education, it's a problem of poverty. Now, that doesn't mean that public education, especially for poor children, doesn't need improvement, it does. But the ed reform movement is really based on a large number of false assumptions and erroneous analysis. Third, can teachers compensate for all of the obstacles that prevent children in poverty from performing as well as middle class and affluent students? Since 1966, all the research, this has never been disproven, all the research shows that when you take all in-school factors together, they account for only 1/3 of any student's performance in school. Now, teachers are the most important in-school factor, but they're not the only in-school factor. For example, the quality of a principal in a school is extremely important. Then when you look at out-of-school factors, and top of the list would be family income, family education, but then you also have to look at neighborhood violence, healthcare, housing stability, and so on. Those factors account for 2/3 of how a student is going to perform. So the idea that you can fix public education by fixing the teachers is really just nonsense. Individual teachers will be able to help some students overcome poverty, but they can't do it for everyone. The number of children in need, which is now 15 million in the United States, is too great, their circumstances are too severe, and the resources are too limited. So what are the results of the ed reform movement so far? It's produced astonishingly few successes. Only 17% of charter schools show any improvement over the district schools with the same demographics. The movement has created a misguided national goal of getting as many low-income kids as possible signed up for college, just signed up, without giving them the preparation and the real job prospects that they need to succeed. And this movement is undermining democracy. It's basically taking public out of public school. So who supports these ill-conceived reforms, and why in the world would they support them? First, conservatives who dislike government in general and who are interested in privatizing public education. Second, religious groups who would like to get government subsidies for their schools. Third, the corporate ed reform industry. And in the last decade or so, this has turned into a real industry. There are many thousands of people who design and sell software for online instruction, testing, grading, teacher training, and so on, charter school management organizations, and then the many consulting firms and advocacy groups and think tanks that are all part of this ed reform movement. Centrist Democrats, including the Obama administration, who have bought the reform arguments, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Then many large foundations that have invested billions of dollars and their reputations on these reforms. And last but not least, all of the political forces that want to weaken the labor movement in general and teachers' unions in particular. I mean, as you probably know, the National Education Association is by far the largest union in the United States. The third or fourth largest union is the American Federation of Teachers. These two unions, along with AFC and SEIU, really make up a substantial part of the ground game of the Democratic Party in elections. If these unions are undermined, that is very much to the advantage of conservatives and Republicans. Now, I don't know how much all of you know about this ed reform movement. What was shocking to me was how late I found out about it. I thought that I was well informed and politically knowledgeable. But the mainstream media have completely accepted the reformers' narrative, and I would say that most people in the United States, including liberals, have taken a pro-reform position. Of course, the best way to find out about this, to inform yourselves, is by reading Dissent Magazine, where in addition to wonderful articles about higher education, there's a whole roster of people who have been writing about K through 12 education. I want to say just a word about private foundations. They have been key in launching, financing, and promoting the current ed reform movement. In the lead, of course, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They often work in conjunction with the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation, but also they bring along other philanthropies. For example, Ford, Hewlett, Annenberg, Milligan, Robertson, and others. And there's a fundamental criticism that democratic socialists have to make about large, powerful private foundations. And this is, they operate with absolutely no democratic accountability. If these foundations undermine public education, they are accountable to no one, not students, parents, educators, society as a whole. The ed reformers have been very successful so far in building a political coalition. This includes all of the forces that I've mentioned. The movement has access to tremendous financial resources. It runs campaigns for ed reform legislation at the state level and also pro-ed reform candidates. In most states, the political coalition has gotten at least part of its agenda passed, and we probably know that one state legislature after another is passing this requirement that teachers in schools be evaluated by standardized test scores of the students. And then there are federal policies that have contributed tremendously to this ed reform movement, and that includes George Bush's No Child Left Behind and Barack Obama's Race to the Top. So I just want to say this in conclusion. If you ask yourself, what about the United States today makes this politicized ed reform movement both so successful and so dangerous for democracy, you would list these factors, I think. The dominant market ideology in this country, inadequate public resources, massive concentrations of wealth, and unlimited private money in political campaigns. And you should note that these are exactly the same factors that make all progressive politics so difficult in this period in the United States.
Can you hear me great with this volume? This is not echoing too much. Everyone's okay with this volume? Okay, excellent. So there's something about being the last speaker after a very long day of conferences and panels, and it is doubly hard because I know that there is a party right after this, and I am the one thing standing in between you and having a drink and dancing and getting some food. But sadly, this is going to be about 45 minutes, so please lock down. No, we're going to try to do this quick. I'm really looking forward to engaging with people who are actually on the front lines of these battles. People who have friends going to Teach for America, people who are fighting the privatization of schools, people who are maybe considering being a teacher, which is one of the most noble professions that is being incredibly demonized. I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments, so please write down questions. I'm really looking forward to engaging. So I'm here to talk a little bit about higher education, which is obviously very much on people's minds, and specifically the experience of higher education and young people. And you know, there's obviously everywhere you look at a headline, the headlines are just really shockingly bad, right? So, you know, the numbers you see associated with student debt are increasing across every metric we can measure. So, the percent of people who have them, the percent of people, how much they have, delinquency rates, across every demographic, student loans are increasing. College education and achievement is increasingly being linked to privilege. Your parents' education is becoming a much stronger indicator of your education, which is a very new thing that has a lot to do with inequality. If you look at We Are the 99% Tumblr, student debt was the #1 concern that they had there. If you were involved with Occupy at all, people were very interested in that stuff. And then there's just the violence. We've seen in America a lot of police brutality against students. The UC Davis pepper spray cop is obviously the most famous one, but across campus, that is a global phenomenon. I mean, you see state violence in Chile, Mexico. I wrote once Puerto Rico, which is another country, and everyone told me that actually Puerto Rico is part of the United States, which made me feel super ignorant. But Puerto Rico, University of Puerto Rico had a very serious occupation. So I like to break it down to 3 separate crises we're going to talk about. Each with their own thing that impacts young people, and that's probably why maybe you've become politically active because of one of these 3. One is mass youth unemployment, or mass unemployment period, of which disproportionately hits young people, student loans, and the whole situation on student loans, and then the longer-term crisis of accessibility and affordability of higher education. I'm going to talk about each of those in order, and then you can take off. Now, the title of this whole event is Fighting Austerity, or Resisting Austerity, right? One of the devilish things about austerity politics is that it becomes zero-sum, even when it does not need to be. So when I say, we should make public education free, you're going to say, why would, if we had $10 billion to give to higher education, why wouldn't we want to make universal preschool with that money? Why would you prefer to give it to people who are going to make a lot more money? And your obvious answer is, well, we can do both, right? We're a rich country that can provide these things. But when you're locked in the kind of austerity battles, that's something you have to resist. So that's one thing I ask you to keep in mind. The other thing is, what is the kind of vision you want of higher ed? You came up with the publicness of public education in the previous talk, but you're going to get in fights, you're in battle, you're going to try to organize people, you're going to try to influence people or the conversation in such a way that you're going to argue this number or that number, but you want to keep an underlying vision of why this is important. Because you will have good faith people on the left say, like, look, is free higher ed really the most important goal we have right now? Why isn't, there's a lot of social ills, shouldn't that be at the back of the list? So we're going to talk a little bit about all 3. So to start very quickly, mass unemployment. The reason that there's so much unemployment is because the economy does not have enough spending power to buy all the things that are necessary to bring about full employment. This is a basic full employment problem. It's largely the result of consumers retrenching after the housing crash, corporations sitting on a ton of money that they're not giving to their employees because they have no bargaining power, the government retrenching even though interest rates are as cheap as they're ever going to be, and the government can essentially invest in things for free, and the Federal Reserve basically being in check from how it normally influences the economy. People put different weightings on those 4, but that's the full employment angle is always something to keep in mind. I mean, any amount of student debt is going to be very difficult if you have no job. We good faith people who rely a lot on education reform to try to boost wages will have a much more advantaged and realistic expectation of what can be accomplished if people actually can get jobs and have bargaining power and wage increases through those mechanisms. So, the unemployment angle, I think, is always kind of important in the background. It is very ironic that one thing people would tell you is if you go to college, then you'll be able to get a job. At least I'm 34, and that's what I was told. Young people graduating right now obviously have very high unemployment. And they also have student loans, which brings us to the second topic. So I want you to think of the kinds of loans that the private markets can generate, the kind of financial consumer products. What kind of loans can you get? Put aside student loans for a second. You can get a loan for a car, you can get a loan for a home. Why can you do that? Because you have collateral. If you don't pay it, they will take your home, they will take your car. That's part of the contract. You can also get a payday loan, you can get a credit card, you can get things that are short-term, or at least implicitly supposed to be short-term, and are heavily, that pay a high interest, right? What is a student loan? It's an investment in your long-term capabilities. The private market cannot do that. They cannot take your education from you, from your mind, at least not yet. Let's hope that technology has not come across, but that would change that would probably give you a lower interest rate. That would be kind of terrible, kind of a bad sci-fi movie. Crucially, of course, is that, if you look at private student loans, especially in the past before the government essentially backstopped them, they were very high interest. The private market is just not meant to do this. This is something the government needs to do. So starting in the 60s, for a variety of reasons, they introduced student loans to start to cover basic expenses. And then as education became less accessible and less affordable, student loans were meant to actually increase your purchasing power over tuition. So what was supposed to cover living expenses quickly became the means of financing tuition. We're going to talk a little bit about college costs in a minute. But with that in mind, the government has tried very hard to get the private market to lend in student loans, essentially backstopping their loans. During the financial crash, actually, all that funding in the private market for student loans collapsed, which is why the government took it over. It was actually part of the bailouts. The government just took over the student loan industry, and reforms in healthcare, Obamacare, formalized that. So most student loans going forward are going to be government loans. Now, I assume you're all social democrats, so you're all, been very excited about the government taking over parts of the economy and subjecting them to democratic will. Yet it feels like this is not actually a good outcome if the government is backstopping huge loans to young people to invest in their basic capabilities. So what are some of the reasons that you might feel that way? One is because a lot of the basic protections have been taken off. When people are lent to, there are certain types of legal protections that are built into them. If you want to go a bit further, all property is essentially a creation of the state, and the state creates certain boundaries and restrictions and rules on how those property restrictions work. And so for one thing, student loans cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. It is incredibly difficult to do that. I saw that there was a pamphlet downstairs. Maybe they found a way, but in general, it is very difficult to get rid of student loans in bankruptcy. Other protections. Social Security, for instance. Your Social Security cannot be used to pay debts. That's actually in the 1935 bill. That it's not meant, because they did not want, private creditors swamping old people and taking their money. The Social Security is a guaranteed basic living standard in old age, but that can be taken for paying student loans. There's no statute of limitations. A lot of consumer credit protection is nebulous in a lot of these spaces. So a lot of these restrictions have been removed, and they've been removed relatively recent. As of 1989, if you had waited 5 years, you could have, with good faith, you could have bankruptcy remove student loans. It was not eligible to take your old age pension. It wasn't eligible. You had better consumer protections in terms of collection agencies than you did, than you do now. So one thing is just to restore some of those basic protections. Bankruptcy law is a plastic thing that can be molded to do all kinds of different things. If we're concerned about moral hazard or whatnot, there are ways to adjust for that. But broadly speaking, one achievable goal we could accomplish in student loans is bringing back basic consumer protections. We can talk at length, and if you go online, you can find a lot of different proposals for this. There are a couple floating out there right now. Another proposal is, one nice thing about taxes is that if you make no no money, you don't have to pay taxes, which is one reason you might want to fund education just out of taxes rather than debt, right? Debt forces a certain level of work. If you're a corporate finance theory geek like I am, you know that one reason corporations take on debt is to force a certain level of action by internal agents. And there's no, I don't know if there's a conspiracy here, but there's a certain, if you feel like you have to take a crappy job to pay off your student loans, that's true, you do. And that's, I don't know if it's an accident or not, but there's a reason it contorts your behavior in a certain way. Where, if you're broke, you don't have to pay taxes the same way. Another reason to think of, another way of thinking of student loans is a kind of uniquely problematic form of debt. Is if you're a social democrat, think about some of the things you like about the state. What are they? The state providing goods like healthcare. Why do you want the state to provide healthcare? Beyond the fact, as opposed to private industry. Well, you like it because it has a long-term horizon. The young can pay the old age pensions of the old, who can then expect the young people to pay for them when they become old. It has compulsion. It can force everyone to buy healthcare. That way you have one market that, insurance markets, when they get very big, they're much better at internally insuring themselves. In addition to compulsion and long-time frame, there's no cost-benefit analysis. There's not a strict fiduciary, profit-seeking motive, right? They're not going to try to, they're not going to kick off someone from, universal health care just because they can, sneak around them, right? They don't have, a certain liability to maximize profits. Now, that's great when it comes to social insurance, but it is terrible when it comes to student loans, right? Because the long time horizon means they will wait till you are a very old person to get your student loans. The compulsion means that they can take, they will find a way to take your income, right? They see everything. It's the IRS. All this income goes through the government. And crucially, the lack of cost-benefit analysis means that even if it was profitable to write down your debt or give you kind of a breather space, like a lot of private debt will do, the government has no interest in doing that. It will wait you out. There's no point in which they're going to say, hey, let's just let this go. So that's one reason why we want to focus the state on things that are helpful, like social insurance, and away from some of the more reactionary things, like enforcing payday lending. So, higher education. Sorry about this. Spinning wheel. It's fantastic. Okay, so don't trust simple theories of what is going on with higher education. Higher education in the United States is a very diverse ecosystem. There are more people who attend public 2-year schools than there are people who attend public 4-year schools, than there are people who attend private 4-year schools. Now, I imagine a lot of people here are pretty smart kids, of course you're social democrats, so perhaps you go to a very good school, perhaps a school that's very competitive and hard to get into. That's not going to be the experience of the median person or the average person who goes through higher education. They may go in and out of a state university for a few years, they may go to a community college for a couple of years, work for a couple of years and then go back. They may take longer years, they may leave after an associate's degree. There's a rich ecology that goes on. And so what you'll often find is critics of higher education take pathologies of part of it and point it to the other thing. So let's say, really expensive private 4-year schools, they fund all these jacuzzis and wall climbing things, and they have all these expensive gyms. That's why we should privatize community colleges and give it all to the for-profit industry. And wait a minute, those are actually two radically different problems. Community colleges aren't that expensive. The problem is that you're not funding them adequately. So watch for that. One theory I really like about how to understand what's happening in private ed, or higher ed, is something called the Brazilian effect. And it's by an education scholar named John Aubrey Douglas. He studies international higher education. What he found is in Poland and a couple other places, but especially Brazil, places that were becoming rich very quickly and modernizing very quickly and did not have infrastructure, public infrastructure, growing at the same rates, forcibly had to have for-profit or private, broadly, institutions try to fill that gap. And they were terrible at it. And the government can write checks very quickly, much quicker than it can, build a full functioning education system. So they would say, okay, so we need education, let's write checks. Let's, give people grants and give people subsidized loans and create a special partnership and push money out the door quickly to try to build these institutions. And what private institutions are doing, you see it in K through 12, they take the money and say thank you, and then they give a really crappy service out the back door. Right? So they enrich themselves and provide a terrible service. Okay? And that's what he refers to as the Brazilian effect. We have that in reverse. We are a rich modern country with a well-functioning public system that we are letting disintegrate or forcibly causing to stagnate, and then expecting the private sector broadly to pick up the slack, and that is not happening. And the more we try to push money out the door, the more we see costs escalate. The more we rely on the for-profit sector, the more we see they purposely set their tuition to maximize the amount of grants and student loans they can pull out of the government, while basically not funding at all, putting all their money into recruitment as opposed to education. And so I think that's one reason why you see debt and poor quality go hand in hand. In terms of types of educational institutions, for-profit students have the highest debt load. Their tuition is also the highest. They are not a cheaper thing. The innovation of the private market is not controlled costs at all in higher ed. Okay? So before we go a little bit further, it might be useful to step back and say, so what do we want from higher education, right? So one is we want a blanket commitment for the state to educate all students who want and are capable of higher education. We want a system of mobility. So people who are perhaps not as strong students or people who are returning to school have some level that they can intersect with, say, a community college. And if they are interested and they are capable of advancing up to state colleges and flagships. We want to also, and this has a really long tradition in the United States. It goes back to the 1860s and the land grant universities. But we also, as egalitarians, but also just broadly, we want to collapse the distance between elite education and mass education. This is personally important for me, but I think once you say it that way, it makes sense. And someone else told me about it. My friend Aaron told me about it that way, and I was like, that makes perfect sense. Because, when people talk about dismantling education, they are not talking about Harvard or Ivy League schools. They're talking about state colleges. They're talking about mass education. Same thing with the K-12 movement. The beauty of public education is that we are capable of saying we will not create a hierarchy through our educational system, right? Or we will not, obviously, it's capitalist society, there are huge hierarchies, but we will not institutionalize it by not providing mass education that is of sufficient quality to give everyone a decent chance, right? Now, of course, I'm taking for granted ideas of equality of opportunity, meritocracy and all that. There are problems with our education system. No one's going to say that there isn't. Higher education builds off the dysfunction of K through 12 education, builds off of all kinds of institutional problems, inequalities. At the end of the day, it's hard not to want public higher education, though, because it is the system we have that we know is capable of combating the worst problems. Okay? Now, so what is going on with privatization at the post-secondary level? I think the title of this conference was The Age of Austerity in the Neoliberal Era Combated with Social Democracy, right? Lots of theory. There's, huge debate about what does the price mechanism do? What does it mean to be a socialist? What does it mean to centralize the economy? Sometimes privatization is just about being robbed, right? Sometimes it is just the idea that a bunch of people say, hey, look, the government has a pool of money, let's take it. Crucially, what they actually do is they say, the government gets pools of money and they do good things with it, right? They get pool money and give old people pensions. It's awesome. They get pool money and give people health care. And what people try to do, and it's a very savvy thing when you think about it, is they try to get in between there and say, you know what, give me the money and I'll give that stuff to people, right? Instead of just giving people health care, give me the money, I'll create this thing called premium support and I'll give it to people, don't worry. Or, old age pensions, that's not that cool. The stock market, it's pretty cool. Give me the money and I'll invest in the stock market for all these people, and that'll work. And so, I do actually think you have to engage with what the price system means and neoliberalism and David Harvey and all that. But crucially, you also have to know that you're being robbed sometime. And, so there's two elements to watch when it comes to post-secondary education. One is just the defunding and the dismantling of public education. You experience it most viscerally through the tuition. Tuition goes up, does not go down. Like, it goes up in tough times, it does not go down in good times. Huge wrench effect. As tuition goes up, it's harder to conceive of it as a genuinely public good. It's more of just like a private consumption good. So it's very difficult to pull back on it. It's one reason I think why the Quebec students were so right to fight very hard for something that was like $100 or $300 tuition increases. If you're in the UC system, that's like nothing. But once you start pulling on that wrench, it's very difficult to push back. But I actually don't think tuition is the most important part. What you're actually seeing is a genuine decommitment. Is that a word? Uncommitment? Reversal of the commitment to provide higher education people. So what you see is more out-of-state students, which pay a higher margin. You see a rejection of the minimum number of in-state students that have to be educated in, right? So suddenly, instead of like the state of Illinois, the state of California, the state of New York, the state of Ohio, it's educating its young people, now it's just providing a service in the global market. You see queuing in lines, right? So you see, too many people trying to go to community college. You see too many people trying to go to a state college, right? Normally, when there's too much demand, we should increase the supply out, but we're not doing that. How am I doing on time? Okay. When was that put there?
About a minute ago.
Okay, good. I looked down, I see the 5 minutes, and I was that there for 10 minutes? Am I the worst person in the world? But then you also, so you see a general, and then crucially, you also see a delinking of the internal mobility of the higher education system, right? So states differ in this, but most of them have a three-part system, right? Community colleges, state colleges, flagships. And you have it so that, someone who goes into community college, works really hard, can then transfer up. Suddenly that transfer mechanism is cut. Each of the system is not being administered as a system as a whole, but instead of a bunch of little fiefdoms, all designed to try to make as much money as possible. Okay. And then in the private market, as that's declining, we're not seeing the private market expand. What we are seeing expanding is for-profit schools. And the problems with for-profit schools are well documented. I encourage you to read about them. My favorite metaphor is that the recruiters, one recruiter at one school, and the for-profit industry thinks that this is vilified them, used a metaphor of a pain funnel. They had an actual document called the pain funnel, which was their technique of how to pitch students, which was when a student came in, they would then try to get the student to think about all the misery in their life, and then sell them an upgraded service off that. Like, that's the level. It's boiler room tactics, right? It's shoddy stuff designed to try to rip people off. But that is on the increase. It's 3% 10 years ago. Now it's about 9% of all post-secondary education. It's going to continue to expand unless we expand out the public to balance it out, and also regulate it through the Department of Education. And we're also seeing a move towards online education. I think online education has a lot of possibilities. You could educate the globe. There is a certain type of techie left kind of, you see it in a certain kind of techie left way of viewing the world, this kind of romance of the public domain, where the idea is like everything will be online, and therefore we'll all have it, and we'll get it effortlessly, and it'll be free for all. And so there's a kind of romance of the fact that everything is online will make everything much more accessible. But in practice, that's not the case, right? Education is education for a reason. Like you can learn online and somewhere you can get a shoe repaired online, right? You need someone to help mediate it for you and help work you through it. And there's roles for teachers and all that. This was in the State of the Union. What a big worry is that you're going to see a lot of federal money flow to these things because again, there's this pool of money and a pool of loans that can go to them, and you're going to see a breakage in that direction. So. In short, there's the publicness of the public university is important, right? We can ensure a baseline of quality. We can control costs in a much better way, right? Most of the increase in public state education has gone up because it's been defunded, not because of kind of competitive or productivity reasons. And as such, I think a real commitment to the public university is going to be necessary going forward. These issues will not become less important in the next century. So, thank you.
Let's have another round of applause for our speakers. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions, so I'm going to take those in a minute. But first I want to say something about Serge Bakalian, who's supposed to be speaking today. A lot of you might have heard of him because he was he did the film Default, the student loan documentary that a lot of us have seen here. But he got stuck in California because there was an emergency, so he sends his regards and he's very sorry that he can't make it tonight. So I guess I'll start by taking like 3 questions, and then we'll give it to the panelists, and then we'll open it up again.
Hi, thanks so much for speaking. I enjoy and really appreciate both of your analysis of the problems. My question involves in what we can do as activists to make these 2 issues, which are really, I think we can all say, they are kind of 2 sides of the same issue. They're both 2 sides of the neoliberal austerity project. But I feel like people, when they talk about student debt, talk about the economy and how talk about it as young laborers. When we talk about corporate education reform and the state of our public schools, that's a different issue. It's goods or they're seen as separate issues. What can we do to kind of connect these for people and kind of get a general sense of the state of education from kindergarten through undergraduate education, and kind of connect the dots for people about this whole system of educational austerity?
I'm just going to take 2 more and then we can.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to try to remember these questions. Maybe I will start with the last one just because it's the most recent one that I heard. I think that you're absolutely right that there have to be options in terms of jobs and protections that don't involve everyone going to college. When, like the ed reformers say, 52% of all jobs are going to require a college education. What they don't say is 48% of the jobs won't require a college education, and that not everyone is interested in going to college. And what has dropped out in the United States are things like apprenticeship programs and programs to train skilled people that don't require an academic preparation of a 4-year university or college. So all of that has to be built in to the American system. I mean, just in terms of what we know, what has helped Germany get through this period better than other European countries is their extensive apprenticeship programs, and they have been able to keep manufacturing alive and give people, the chance of a good life without having to go to college. So in a certain way, I think that this idea that you can't, you're not going to have a successful future, which Obama says all the time, unless you get a college education, is problematic in 2 ways. one, even if you get a college education, the jobs aren't necessarily going to be there, but two, there have to be these other alternatives. Then the first question was about the connections. When I was listening to you speak, there must have been like 4 or 5 different things that were exact parallels between K through 12 and higher education. The most striking, of course, is this idea that there are these pools of money that are public money, and the private sector wants to get in there, take the public money, and provide the services, and that the services are going to be crummy, ultimately. That's one. So one interesting thing to do is to isolate those 4 or 5 things that are exact parallels and talk about them that way. You know, that this is, for example, a way that public money is channeled to the private sector to provide something that the public sector historically has done much better, and that can be done in terms of equity really only by the public sector. So it's just like reorganizing the material, but I think it's a really interesting approach that then has a wider appeal. And the third one was about, it was actually the second one, I'm sorry, and I think it was more addressed.
The student debt questions?
Was it? Yes, student debt, so that's you.
All right. So, can you hear me on this? So the question, some of the questions I'm hearing, I've heard it at other panels, is, so, great theory, great numbers, how do we actually turn this into activism? And I do not have good answers for you. I was hoping you would tell me, but you don't have microphones, so that's going to be harder to do. But, how to connect that is hard. There are 2 huge advantages. Well, there's one huge advantage that we have on our side is that, or there's 2. One is that these programs work, and they are also very popular with the public. Look at the Chicago teacher strike. You know, I'm from Chicago, I have friends there, and know people who covered it. They were shocked at how many people were out, giving high fives to the, there was obviously a lot of teachers out in shirts striking, and the public support for them was shockingly high. And I don't know if anyone who would know that, but I just assumed it would be slightly unpopular for no reason, perhaps because I'm part of that whole nonprofit industrial complex that, there's just kind of things in terms of seriousness and all that. But when it comes to this actual mechanism, people love public education. They like their public schools. They think they work well, right? A lot of the things they don't like about them are coded for other things that have to do with cities and racism and that kind of stuff. So I would recommend activists study what went right and what went wrong in Chicago. I don't want to overplay that, but I think that was a really telling moment that some of these ed reform movers are really overplaying their hands. And that might be one place to learn how to start, right? How can we imagine a transition? I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult. One is that these are all state issues, so that provides a different level of access and attack than local or federal issues, right? So you could try to occupy state building, right? You could try to put protests over budget cuts. I mean, these things happen time to the year, so there are points of venue of attack and for activism. The debt is a federal issue. That's going to be a little harder. I think there are moves to try to take some of the harsher elements off. You're seeing different programs being tested and piloted right now to tie student debt to a certain level of your income. That's better than nothing, and I think once that turns, you'll see other things start to turn, like bankruptcy reform, and we'll see how that goes. You obviously have to control costs in the long term for it to make sense to do big things on student debt. Or they have to go together in some ways, but actually they don't. You can do either one. But more of the point is that putting pressure on the worst cases, good reporting on really tough student debt cases, I think do make differences.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 more. Evan and...
This is a question about the education reform we were talking about. And first, I just said briefly, purposes of obviously I'm here, and I think unions are very important. I love unions, especially when my mother is in the American Federation for Teachers, and they've personally helped me in so many ways. I'm very grateful for their help. But you have to be blind to not see that there are very real problems in the union as well. I mean, I know poverty is a huge problem, as well as the potential privatization. But we were talking earlier in an earlier plenary about how there's a lack of politicization in some unions, and they're very conservativeness in some of these bureaucracies, as well as these rubber rooms in New York, and how sometimes it's harder to get rid of bad teachers. So my question is, how on the left can we internally critique and reform these unions to make them stronger fighting forces against this reform? Because I think they're one of the reasons why they're losing is they're of course the right with unions doing a lot of things. Unions aren't Christian.
Are you taking more than one?
Yeah, we'll just do one more. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for talking and for giving your talks. They were amazing and informative and inspiring. So, on top of all of these other problems that you two have mentioned, I think one really huge problem for students that sticks up in my mind is predatory lending practices, mainly by Sally Mae, who's the biggest holder of student debt currently in the country. And these private lenders and the entire privatization of the lenders are just very symbolic of this entire trend of privatization of the entire economy. They literally profit off of students not having money. They profit off of them. So I guess my question is, and I know it was asked, like, what do we do about this? Like, we have all these problems in mind, but how can we fight them? Would it be beneficial for us as a student movement to target these lenders or to target governmental agencies or private companies that you mentioned that give these tests? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Let me take that one. So one place of activism that I did not remember are the schools themselves, right? So a lot of, when you talk about predatory student lending, it's an umbrella of things, but some of them are just, schools push out loans because they get kickbacks in various ways. Targeting the schools themselves is very effective, in part because they're not built to handle that kind of criticism. In that way, right? They handle other criticism very well. But in terms of you are directly ripping off your students and this debt kind of scheme is very useful. Bankruptcy is a good check on the private ones. That's a really new reform. It was in 2005 that private student loans became ineligible for bankruptcy. Crucially, and I think it was an amendment put onto the bankruptcy reform bill that no one can identify who introduced it. And when some documents leaked in 2008, early 2009, after the huge liberal influx into Congress, when the documents leaked from private student lenders, what they were most worried about was the bankruptcy exception. Sally Mae, I think, is the actual document holder. I think New American has the document if you Google it online. But that is what worries them the most, and that's something you could imagine changing in the near future, particularly for private loans.
Okay, about the teachers' union. That's a very important question and a very sticky question. So I think one thing to recognize right away is that the teachers' unions should have taken control of this evaluation issue and made it their own a long time ago. Part of what happened is that the teachers' unions, thinking like unions, said evaluation is a management issue. It's not up to teachers to take responsibility for the evaluation. That's up to management. And that probably turns out to be a mistake, that rather the teachers' unions should have thought more in terms of a kind of craft mentality, that everyone who enters our union has to be highly skilled, has to do the job really well, that kind of professional quality control within the profession itself would have put the unions in a better position now. So they're playing catch-up, sometimes making compromises with some very bad things that are being forced down their throat. But that is a legitimate criticism to make about the unions, and they really will have to begin to take the initiative. And there are excellent teacher evaluation programs that involve teachers and principals and have a union approval. It's the peer review kind of systems that work really well. One thing that I would love to see is for the unions to go on a campaign to establish that in every school. In general, you have to be very careful about the information about teachers' unions. So this is one example, the infamous rubber rooms. Rubber rooms did not exist in New York City before the Bloomberg administration. They are a creation of Michael Bloomberg, and they have worked tremendously to discredit teachers and the unions. Rubber rooms are, okay, this is the story. It used to be that when teachers were put on probation for some reason, sometimes quality, sometimes it just had to do with the school was closing or downsizing and there wasn't another place for the teacher to go. These teachers who weren't actively teaching would be used in administrative offices, or they'd take jobs within the union. So what happened with the Michael Bloomberg administration is that he set a rule that if a principal said that teacher should be taken out of the classroom, the teacher was immediately pulled out of the classroom. Due process still existed, but in the interim, rather than the teacher going to, do some useful work elsewhere or in the office, the teacher was just sent to these holding pens that were called rubber rooms. There were like 7 of them around the city of New York. They had security guards. People would just sit in there all day, and they were still on salary. But that was a creation of the Bloomberg administration. The Bloomberg administration let a photographer and a reporter get into the rubber rooms, which should have not happened. And a long, glitzy article about it came out in the New Yorker. And I think that this turned probably, 50% of all liberals against public school teachers in general and the union. It was a really horrible, horrible thing. The New Yorker was absolutely irresponsible about that article because how the rubber rooms came about was never indicated in that article. So, this is one of these things where you just need that information to be able to counter that particular argument, and yet, as you said, there are legitimate criticisms to be made. I think always democratic socialists have to take this attitude of critical support to the unions. One, it's great if you're in a union and you can work to democratize and improve your union. But you have to recognize all the warts, but then recognize the tremendous importance of workers being able and professionals being able to have a union. I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, let's have another round of applause.